The night Adrian Blackthorne decided to destroy his wife, he didn't raise his voice once. That was the part no one understood about him. Not the servants who pressed their ears against oak doors, not the advisors who watched from careful distances, not even the woman standing in the center of his study with rain beginning to hammer the windows behind her. People expected fury from powerful men. They expected the overturned furniture, the shattered glass, the voice that climbed until it cracked. What they did not expect was stillness. What they could not prepare for was a man who had learned, somewhere in the architecture of his ruined childhood, that the coldest rage was the kind that never needed to announce itself. Adrian stood at his desk and looked at his pregnant wife and said, in a voice as level as a blade laid flat on stone, "Get out of my house." And that was the moment Vivian Hale understood she had married something she would never fully survive. The letters had arrived 3 days before. Vivian had not seen them, had not been permitted to see them, which was itself a kind of answer to a question she hadn't known to ask. She had learned about them the way she learned about most things at Blackthorne Manor, through the careful silences that fell when she entered a room, through the way eyes slid away from hers at breakfast, through the particular quality of stillness that overtook the household staff when something had shifted in the Duke's interior weather and the rest of the world was simply waiting to discover what it meant. She had been in the East Library when Eleanor Marsh, her personal maid, had come to find her. Eleanor, who had served her loyally since the wedding. Eleanor, whose face had been trained into careful neutrality for so long that the cracks in it were almost more frightening than open grief. Eleanor had stood in the doorway with her hands clasped in front of her apron and said, very quietly, that His Grace was asking for her in the study. Not requesting. Asking, Eleanor said, but her voice put the word in quotation marks it would carry forever. Vivian had set down the volume she was reading, some forgettable history of northern agriculture that she had not been reading at all, had been holding in front of her face while her mind turned slow circles around the child moving inside her, around the particular mathematics of hoping for something from a man who had never promised it. And she had smoothed her dress and followed Eleanor down the corridor with the specific kind of composure that was really just fear that had run out of room to be anything else. She was 6 months along. She walked carefully on the polished floors. The study smelled of wood smoke and something sharper underneath, the particular combination of fine tobacco and cold stone that she had come to associate with Adrian at his most remote. He was standing when she entered, not seated behind the massive desk the way he usually was when conducting the business of the dukedom, but standing beside the window with his back partially toward her, watching the early darkness settle over the grounds. He was still wearing his riding coat. He had not bothered to change. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. The silence lasted long enough that Vivian heard the fire shift in its grate, heard the distant sound of wind beginning to work itself up outside, heard her own heartbeat in a way she usually managed to ignore. Then he turned around, and she saw his face, and she knew that whatever Eleanor's careful neutrality had been protecting her from, this was it. She had studied Adrian Blackthorne's face for 2 years. She had catalogued its variations the way a woman living in a country with unpredictable weather learns to read the sky. Not because she loved the weather, though she had, God help her, come to love it, but because her survival had always depended on knowing what was coming. She knew the particular set of his jaw that meant he was managing something difficult in the estate accounts. She knew the way his eyes went flat and distant when one of his political enemies had made a move he hadn't anticipated. She knew the almost invisible softening around his mouth that happened rarely when he forgot to be the Duke of Blackthorne for a moment and was simply a man sitting across a dinner table from a woman who had asked him something that surprised him into genuine thought. She did not know the face he was wearing now. It was outside her catalog entirely. There was no anger in it, none of the controlled force she had learned to read and navigate. There was something far worse. There was absolute certainty, the kind that had already completed its journey through doubt and come out the other side into a place where nothing she said would be able to follow. He crossed to the desk and picked up a sheaf of papers and held them out to her. She took them. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that later. She read them. They were letters, allegedly in her handwriting, allegedly written to a man named Charles Delmore, a younger son of a minor baronetcy, someone she had danced with twice at court functions before her marriage and had not thought about since. The letters were detailed. They were intimate in a way that made her stomach turn, not because they were scandalous, but because they were so carefully constructed, so precisely calibrated to devastate. Whoever had written them had understood exactly what would hurt most. Not passion, not recklessness, but calculation. The letters made her sound like a woman who had married Adrian Blackthorne with cold deliberation for the protection his title offered while maintaining a real connection elsewhere. They made her sound like someone who pitied him. "These aren't mine," she said. "I know what your handwriting looks like." "Someone copied it. Adrian." The seal on the third letter. He said it without inflection, cutting her off not with force but with a finality that was almost geometrical. "That's not a copied seal. That's the actual signet ring I gave you when we married." Vivian looked at the third letter. The wax was dark red, and the impression was exact. The small ivy and dagger design that had been pressed into the gold of the ring she wore on her right hand. She looked down at her hand. The ring was there. She had not taken it off in 2 years. "Someone could have—" "How?" he said. It wasn't a question. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Vivian stood very still and felt the child move inside her. A small shifting, a series of pressures like something testing the limits of the world it lived in. And she understood with a terrible clarity that she was being tried in a court that had already reached its verdict. The evidence was not the point. The letters were not the point. The point was that Adrian Blackthorne had looked at those letters and felt something, and whatever he had felt had been sufficient. And now he was standing in front of her with that face she didn't recognize, and there was nothing available to her. No argument, no demonstration of her own grief, no appeal to 2 years of trying that was going to reach him through it. "Who showed these to you?" she asked. Something moved in his expression, the first real movement since she'd entered the room. "That's your question," he said. Someone hands me evidence of your—" He paused, and the pause was worse than any word he might have chosen. "Your correspondence, and your question is who. Because it matters who. Because whoever gave you those letters is the person who wrote them, and if you would just—" "Lady Constance brought them to me herself. She said she'd been sitting on them for months because she didn't want to be the one to—" He stopped, his jaw tightened. "She was crying when she showed me. That's what you'd like to know. She was devastated on my behalf. It's Lady Constance Alford." Vivian thought of her, beautiful, calculated, perpetually positioned at the precise coordinates in any room that would make her most visible to the most powerful men, and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the November wind outside the windows. "Constance Alford has wanted this dukedom since before you married," Vivian said. "She has been trying to—" "Don't!" The single syllable was quiet and absolute. "I have spent 2 years watching you navigate this household. I have watched you smile at women who despise you and manage men who underestimate you and conduct yourself with a consistency that I—" He stopped again. Whatever he had been about to say, he chose not to say it. "I gave you credit. I gave you more credit than I give most people, which means I know exactly how capable you are of doing something like this and managing how it appeared. The cruelty of it, the precise, surgical cruelty, was that he was trying to pay her a compliment. He thought he was being clear-eyed, rigorous, fair in his own merciless way. He had respected her enough to believe she was capable of real deception. There was almost something there that she might have loved under different circumstances, the absolute consistency of how he saw the world, if it hadn't been pointed directly at her sternum. "Adrian." She heard her own voice and was surprised by it, flat, stripped of pleading, stripped of the particular softness she had spent 2 years carefully deploying in this house. She was done with softness. It had not purchased her anything. "I am carrying your child. I am 6 months along with your heir, and I have not left this property in 4 months, and I have not written a letter to anyone without your household secretary present since—" "The secretary who was dismissed in September," he said, "after you stopped requesting him." "I stopped requesting him because you told me the household budget required—" "Vivian." And now there was something in his voice, not warmth, nothing as accessible as warmth, but a kind of exhausted gravity, the tone of a man who had been through the argument already in his own head, at length in the small hours of the night, and had come out somewhere she couldn't reach him. I am not going to do this. You are not going to hear me. I'm not going to stand here and you're not going to hear me, she said again, louder, and something in her own voice frightened her. It was not hysterical. It was not desperate. It had the quality of a statement being engraved rather than spoken. You decided before I walked in. You had already decided. The letters could have said anything. The seal could have been identical to mine or nothing like it, and you would have found a way to arrive at the same place. Because this is what you wanted. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. This one had a texture. What I wanted, he said. An exit. She couldn't stop herself now. She could feel it, the specific momentum of truth telling that had been held back for too long, the way it overtook her, the way she stopped trying to hold it. You married me because you needed an heir and I was acceptable and my family needed the alliance. You have spent 2 years managing the inconvenience of actually having to live with someone, and you have been waiting, not consciously, maybe, not deliberately, but waiting, for something that would let you make this tidy again. Make me a problem you solved instead of a person you failed. The room was very quiet. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. His face had gone back to something unreadable, but it was a different kind of unreadable now. Not the cold certainty of before, but something more tightly controlled, which in her experience meant something worse. Get out of my house, he said. She thought she had misheard him. What? Tonight. He turned back to the window. I'll send word to your family in the morning. You'll be provided for financially. The child, when it's born, will... The child. The words came out of her like stones. The child. You are speaking to me about the child in this context. Will be raised at Blackthorne Manor if the paternity... She crossed the room in 4 steps and hit the desk with her palm, hard enough to scatter the papers, hard enough to make the inkstand rattle. He turned from the window sharply, and for one moment she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Genuine surprise. The surprised alarm of a man who had completely misjudged the nature of what he was dealing with. If the paternity, she said. The words came out very slowly and very clearly, because she wanted them to exist in the world with perfect precision and be understood and be remembered by him, by whatever corner of her own memory would replay this night for the rest of her life. You will not speak to me about the paternity of this child. You will not. You will look at me, and you will tell me what I did. Not what those letters say, not what Constance Alford told you with tears she manufactured for an audience of 1. What I did. Tell me what I did to you. He said nothing. Tell me. The wind outside had risen to a serious pitch. She could hear it working at the windows, could hear the first hard spatter of rain against glass. You have 1 hour, he said. Take what you need. She took almost nothing. Later, when she tried to understand why, she thought it was the same instinct that made a person move very carefully in the presence of something they didn't want to fully believe. If she took only the essentials, if she carried nothing that felt like she was preparing to be away for long, then she was not yet fully accepting the reality of what was happening. She was still, in some small and terrible way, expecting the door to open behind her, expecting his voice in the corridor, expecting something, some molecule of what she had thought existed between them, to prevent the completion of this. Eleanor helped her in silence, and the silence between them was a different kind than the one in the study. This one was the silence of a woman trying not to weep in front of someone she was failing. Come with me, Vivian said. Eleanor looked at her. Her eyes were red-rimmed. My mother is in the village. His Grace would dismiss my family's tenancy. Vivian nodded. She had already known this. She had asked anyway. She put on her heaviest cloak and her sturdiest boots, and she thought about the child with a ferocity that was almost violent. Not the gentle floating thought of a woman anticipating, but the hard focused thought of a woman preparing, the kind of thinking that was really the early language of survival before the body has caught up to what the mind already knows. The child was real. The child was her own, hers completely regardless of anything else. And the child was coming in 3 months, and she was walking out of Blackthorne Manor in November with a storm working itself into a serious fury overhead, and she had 32 pounds in the small leather bag Eleanor pressed into her hands and almost nothing else. The staff had been informed. She could tell by the way the corridors were emptier than usual, people making themselves scarce, refusing to be witnesses to something they'd have to live inside afterward. The two who remained visible, a footman at the main stairs, old Harriet from the kitchens who had pressed a wrapped packet of food and dried meat into Vivian's hands with the wordless ferocity of a woman who had outlived her capacity for restraint, kept their eyes down. The front doors opened onto the night. It was not just raining, it was the kind of storm that had clearly been building for days, the kind that had a quality almost like malice, the wind coming from two directions at once, and the rain already halfway to sleet, the gravel drive turning dark, and the line of bared trees along the avenue bending and whipping in a way that would have been beautiful at a window. Vivian stood on the top step and looked at it. She turned once. She didn't know why. Some last involuntary reaching, the same motion she'd been making for 2 years, checking to see if the door had opened, if he'd come, if any of the gravity between them had accumulated into something sufficient to make him cross whatever distance he required to remain at. The doors were closed. She turned back to the storm and walked into it. But the first hour, she focused only on the road. She had walked this road in better conditions, had ridden it dozens of times. The route from Blackthorne Manor to the nearest village was 8 miles, long but manageable in daylight and reasonable weather, the kind of journey that, in ordinary life, was a mild inconvenience. In the dark, in rain that had graduated fully to sleet by the time she reached the first crossroads, carrying a leather bag in one hand and holding her cloak together at the throat with the other, 8 miles was something else. Her boots were good. She was grateful for the boots with a specificity she had never previously felt about footwear. Grateful in the primitive, granular way of a body that understands it is dealing with something serious and is inventorying resources. The cloak was good too. The food Harriet had packed was real food, not symbolic food, something that told her the old woman had understood something Adrian had not. She thought about Constance Alford and the way crying had been described. She was crying when she showed me, and she felt something in her chest that was not grief exactly, was more like a very pure and clarifying anger, the kind that burned clean enough to be almost useful. Someone had studied her handwriting. Someone had obtained her seal or a cast of it, or had bribed a craftsman to reproduce it exactly. Someone had constructed a series of letters over what must have been weeks, had calibrated them with genuine intelligence, had chosen exactly the right recipient to deliver them. A woman like Constance, beautiful and apparently devastated, a source no man like Adrian would think to interrogate. It had been a careful operation. It had required someone who understood both her and Adrian with some precision. She catalogued everyone she knew. The sleet was coming sideways now. She put her head down and walked. By the 3rd mile, her hands were past cold and into something less responsive, a dull non-feeling that she registered with some distant part of her mind as a problem to be managed and then pushed back out of focus. She needed to focus on the road. The road was real and present, and her feet needed to stay on it. Everything else, Adrian's face at the window, the sound of the letters scattering across the desk, the particular weight of the doors closing behind her. Everything else was material she did not have the body heat to afford right now. The child moved. She stopped walking for a moment. Just a moment. Put her free hand over her stomach through the thick wool of the cloak and stood in the sleet and let the movement be real. "I know," she said to it out loud, which was something she had never permitted herself before. Had been too conscious of how it looked, too afraid of what it meant to be a woman talking to the inside of herself in the corridors of a house that was not hers and was never going to become hers regardless of what the marriage register said. Out here in the dark, and the storm with no one watching, it was different. "I know, I'm walking." She kept walking. She had covered perhaps 5 miles when the world began to go wrong in a different way. Not the cold, which had settled into something managed and steady, and not the exhaustion, which she was riding on a specific kind of refusal that felt like it could outlast the night. What went wrong was the road itself, or her reading of it. A wrong turning somewhere in the dark, one of the crossroads missed or taken badly, so that when the grove of elms that should have signaled the approach to the village did not materialize where she expected it, she stopped and turned and looked around and understood with a falling sensation that she did not entirely know where she was. The sleet had turned back to rain, heavier rain. She kept moving because stopping was not a viable option. She had catalogued that much with certainty. Movement was warmth, however inadequate, and warmth was survival, and survival was the only thing she had that the child inside her could rely on. She moved through the dark and the rain with the focused animal stubbornness of something that does not yet know whether it will be permitted to live, but has decided to require considerable effort on the part of anything that means to prevent it. The ditch was invisible in the dark. She went down hard, catching herself partially on one hand and partially on her hip, the leather bag catching under her and the cloak twisting in a way that dragged her sideways. The fall was not catastrophic. She understood this immediately. The instinct inventory again, cataloging joints and resistances. But her ankle had turned on something at the edge, and when she tried to stand, the ankle reported back with a specific and serious insistence that reclassified the situation. She sat in the mud at the edge of the road in the rain and looked at the dark. For the first time since she had walked out of Blackthorne Manor's front door, she felt something she recognized as the preliminary shape of fear. Not of Adrian, not of Constance Alford, or the conspiracy she hadn't yet been able to think through completely. Fear of this. Of a ditch on an unknown road in November. Of a turned ankle and 3 months of pregnancy and no one who knew where she was. She had not, until this precise moment, understood that she was entirely alone. She pulled herself upright against the roadside bank and tried the ankle again, and got as far as one weight-bearing step before the ankle's argument became too precise to override. She stood on one leg in the rain and looked up the road in both directions and saw nothing. No light, no movement, no indication that the world contained anything other than dark and water. And felt the fear clarify into something harder and more workable, the way extreme cold sometimes clarified into a quality that was almost like calm. She was not going to die in this ditch. She was not going to allow it. She had not walked 5 miles in sleet, had not stood in Adrian Blackthorne's study and listened to him call the paternity of her child into question, had not light, not much of it. A single window, perhaps 200 yards up and to the left of the road, half hidden by what looked like a stand of pines. Yellow light, the real light of an interior fire or lamp rather than the blue-white of the storm, and she stood in the rain and looked at it with the specific gratitude of someone who has just been handed back something they hadn't finished needing. She moved toward it. Slowly, badly, the ankle protesting with every step in language she was learning to partially ignore. Through a gate that was latched but not locked. Up a stone path that was mostly flat. To a door. She knocked, the sound of movement inside. The particular pattern of a household light changing as someone moved through rooms with a lamp. The door opened. He was perhaps 60, lean and white-haired, with the kind of face that had been refined by decades of paying attention to things. The face of someone who had spent a great deal of time listening. He was in his nightclothes with a heavy robe thrown over them, and he held the lamp up and looked at her, and she watched his expression complete its journey from guarded surprise to something sharper and more focused. "Get her inside, Mutt," he said, not to her but to someone behind him, and then he was already reaching for her, already closing the distance with a steadiness and economy of motion that she would later understand was the reflex of a physician encountering someone who needed immediate management, not kindness first, but competence, the kindness embedded in the competence. A woman appeared behind him, younger, dark-haired, with the alert eyes of someone who had been recently woken but did not require time to orient. She took Vivian's other arm and they moved her through the door into warmth that hit her like a physical blow, the shock of it after hours in the cold, and she heard herself make a sound that she had not planned to make and felt her legs decide independently that they had finished with the current arrangement. She sat down on something that wasn't the ground. "How far along?" the man was saying, and it took her a moment to understand he was talking to her. 3 months, she said. "Left. 3 months left." He was looking at her ankle, then at her face, then back at her with the specific quality of a man running a rapid assessment and reaching conclusions. "You're safe," he said. It was not comforting exactly. It was clinical. It was the tone of someone establishing a baseline fact as the first step in a process. "You're both safe. Eleanor, get the fire up." "My name is—" she started. "Tell me in the morning," he said. Not unkindly. "Right now you need to be warm." She closed her mouth. The fire in the hearth was beginning to respond to Eleanor's work, climbing, spreading its heat in the slow, reliable way of real wood. and Vivian sat in the chair they had put her in and felt the warmth begin its work on her hands, and she thought of nothing at all for a period of time she could not have measured. Later, much later, she would understand what she was sitting in: the kitchen of Dr. Nathaniel Ashford, retired, and his widowed daughter Eleanor, and the beginning of something that would, over the following months, quietly and completely unmake and remake the person she had been walking toward for years without knowing it. But that was later. For now she sat in the chair and let herself be warm and held every thought at a distance, and the fire talked to itself in the grate, and outside the storm continued its enormous, indifferent work, and somewhere 25 miles southeast of that modest kitchen, in the study of Blackthorne Manor, a man she had loved stood at a window and watched the rain fall on his grounds, and the night stretched out between them like a question that neither of them yet knew how to ask. She did not know it yet, but the letters, the forged, beautiful, lethal letters, had been missing one detail. A detail so small that the person who constructed them had not thought it worth the attention. Vivian had been left-handed since birth. Every letter she had ever written, every signature, every note pressed into a servant's palm or delivered to an attorney's office or signed at the bottom of a household ledger, left-handed. The ink pressure different, the letter formation subtly specific. The kind of thing you would only know if you had watched her write, or had access to a document she'd produced under observation. The forger had copied her right-handed loops. The seal had been perfect. The content had been devastating. But the handwriting was wrong. It was 6 weeks later, during a sleepless night in the Ashford house, when she had run out of things to manage and found herself thinking through the letters in detail for the first time without the fog of shock and cold, that Vivian sat up in the dark and understood this, and understood what it meant. Somewhere in Blackthorne Manor's archive, in the bound correspondence files that Adrian kept with the methodical precision of a man who treated paperwork as a form of order imposed on a world that didn't naturally provide it, there was the original marriage contract, witnessed, notarized, signed by both parties. In her left hand, a document that, if compared to the forged letters with any real attention, would make the forgery visible in an instant. She sat in the dark of the Ashford house with her hand over her stomach and thought about whether Adrian would ever look at it closely enough to see. She thought about whether she wanted him to. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall. This is a work of complete fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and circumstances depicted are entirely imaginary. The marriage contract was in the third drawer of the East Archive cabinet, behind the estate deed and the original land survey of the northern pastures. Adrian found it at 2 a.m, 6 days after Vivian had walked out of Blackthorne Manor into the storm. He had not been looking for it. He had come to the archive room because sleep had become a country he couldn't locate, and when sleep failed him, he worked, because work was the one thing that had never required anything from him except his attention. He had been reviewing the tenant renewal agreements for the winter quarter when something, not a thought exactly, more like a disturbance at the edge of his thinking, the kind of thing that the body registers before the mind catches up, made him pull open the third drawer. He took out the contract and laid it flat on the reading table and looked at it. Vivian's signature, the one she had written on the day they married in the presence of 3 attorneys and his older cousin and her trembling father, the old signature with the maiden name she no longer carried, signed at the bottom of 4 pages of legal language with the careful deliberateness of a woman who understood that she was signing her life into a new shape. Left hand. He stood very still. He picked up the third forged letter from the file he had brought with him. He had been carrying them for 6 days without being able to put them down, the way a man will keep worrying a wound even when he understands the worrying is the problem, and he held it next to the marriage contract and looked at them both. The loops were different, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible to anyone who wasn't looking specifically for it. But there, the downstroke of the capital 5, the angle of the crossbar on the lowercase t, the specific pressure distribution that made her right-hand attempt slightly thicker on the upstroke rather than the down. The right-handed mimicry was very good. It was, in fact, extraordinary work, the work of someone who had spent real time studying her handwriting. But it was studying the wrong hand. Adrian set both documents down on the reading table and stood in the lamplight and did not move for a long time. He thought about Constance Alford, about her face when she had delivered the letters, the specific quality of her distress, how it had been performed in the key of someone almost unable to speak, someone barely holding themselves together for the sake of a friendship they claimed to value. He thought about how she had touched his arm when she left, the light consoling pressure of it, the way her eyes had been wet, but her voice had been clear, the contradiction of it that he had read at the time as evidence of her sincerity and now read as evidence of something else entirely. He thought about Vivian standing at his desk with her hand flat on the scattered papers and saying, "Tell me what I did to you." He had not answered. He reached across the table and pulled the bell cord. The steward arrived in 8 minutes, half-dressed and blinking, his hair disordered and his expression carrying the careful neutrality of a man who had learned that being roused at 2 in the morning by a duke meant you kept your face empty until you understood what was required of you. "Lady Constance Alford," Adrian said. "When did she arrive at the manor?" The steward blinked. "Your Grace?" "The day she brought the letters. What time did she arrive, how long was she here, and who was with her?" "She arrived in the late afternoon, Your Grace, around 4 o'clock. I believe she was accompanied by her lady's maid. They stayed approximately 2 hours. And before that visit, had she been to the manor in the previous month?" The steward's expression shifted, the careful neutrality doing something more complex underneath it, the particular expression of a man who has known something for a while and has been waiting to see whether he would be asked. "She came twice in October, Your Grace. Once for the Harrington dinner, and once, I believed it was a social call on the Duchess, but the Duchess—" He stopped. "The Duchess wasn't home," Adrian said. It was not a question. In October, Vivian had been in the village for 3 days, helping coordinate the autumn charitable distribution she had organized for the tenant families. He had known this. He had known exactly when she was gone. So had Constance. "No, Your Grace, the Duchess was away. Lady Constance was shown to the receiving room and departed after about 40 minutes. The receiving room, which connected by the service corridor to the family quarters, which contained, in the small writing desk by the south window, the signet ring Vivian sometimes left there when she was working with both hands on the household accounts. Adrian looked at the table in front of him. "Wake the head of staff," he said. "I want to know whether anything was reported missing or moved in the receiving room during October, specifically from the writing desk." "At this hour, Your Grace?" Adrian looked at him. The steward left. What came back 40 minutes later was worse than confirmation. The ring had not been taken. It had been borrowed, pressed into wax, presumably, and returned before anyone noticed, slipped back into the dish on the writing desk while Vivian was away, and the staff had no reason to monitor a room that wasn't in use. The head of staff, a woman named Mrs. Pryor, who had been with the Blackthorne household for 20 years, and who delivered this information with the compressed fury of someone deeply offended on behalf of her household's violated orderliness, confirmed that a set of spare wax sticks and the small seal press had been found in a slightly different position than usual when she'd conducted the October inventory. She had noted it and said nothing because she had not understood what it meant. She understood now. She stood in the archive room in her wrapper and her cap and looked at Adrian with the specific expression of a woman waiting to see whether the man in front of her was going to be capable of saying the obvious thing out loud. "She was never here," Adrian said. Mrs. Pryor said nothing. "The letters." He said it to the room rather than to her, his voice flat with something that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but occupied the territory between them, a kind of vast interior pressure that had no clean language. "Vivian never wrote those letters." "No, Your Grace." Very quiet. "I would not think she did." He looked at her sharply. "You knew." "I didn't know anything." A pause, carefully measured. "I thought things. In the days after, when the household understood what had happened, when we understood that the Duchess had been, that she had left. Another pause, the word left landing in the room carrying the weight of what it was actually replacing. "I thought things, Your Grace. I didn't say them because it wasn't my place." "It wasn't your place," he repeated. Mrs. Pryor looked at him steadily. She had 20 years of this household behind her eyes, and she was not frightened of him, not exactly. She was respectful in the way that people who have watched power operate at close range understand the appropriate distances. But she was not going to pretend that her employer's current situation did not contain a dimension of his own making that he needed to acknowledge before he could do anything useful. "No," she said, "it wasn't. You are the Duke of Blackthorne, and decisions about the Duchess were yours to make, and I am the head of domestic staff, and my place is not to question those decisions." She let that sit for a moment. "But you've asked me directly, Your Grace, and so I'll say directly. From the time the Duchess arrived at this house, I watched her try. I watched her learn this household and manage its people and handle the kinds of difficulties that would have broken a woman with less spine, and I never once saw anything in her behavior that resembled what those letters described. Not once." The archive room was very quiet. "Where is she?" Adrian said. Not to Mrs. Pryor, to the room, to the specific problem that had replaced all other problems and was now the only problem, the problem with a face and a voice, and 6 months of pregnancy behind it and 3 months ahead of it, and no shelter he knew of. "I don't know," Mrs. Pryor said. "I don't think anyone knows." He sent riders out the following morning. It was a controlled operation, the kind of thing he was good at, defining the problem, allocating resources, establishing a systematic approach. He told himself it was systematic. He told himself it was the same discipline he applied to any logistical challenge in the management of the dukedom, the same methodical deployment of available tools toward a defined objective. He knew it wasn't. He knew it by the way he stood at the window of his study, the same window he had been standing at when he told her to get out, a fact that had not escaped him and that he was currently unable to think about directly, and watched the riders go out through the main gate and felt something in his chest that did not respond to management, or discipline, or the application of any of the tools he had spent his entire adult life developing. He had sent a pregnant woman into a November storm. He had sent her out because a beautiful woman had cried in his office and handed him forged letters and touched his arm, and he had looked at Vivian's face across his desk and felt the specific terror of someone who has let themselves want something and cannot survive finding out the wanting was wrong. And instead of sitting with the terror long enough to test it, he had resolved it the fastest available way. He had made her the problem. He had turned his own fear into her crime. He stood at the window and let this be true. He was not a man who handled self-indictment well. He had the particular aversion to it that came from having spent his entire childhood in a household where vulnerability was a resource that other people extracted and spent. But he was also not a man who could operate effectively on a false accounting, and the accounting of the last 6 days had been false, and he was going to have to open the books. The riders came back over the following days with nothing. Storm conditions had been severe across the northern and western roads. A woman matching her description had been seen at the Crossroads Inn 6 miles from the manor. But the innkeeper's memory was approximate and his account inconsistent, and the timing didn't hold up when Adrian mapped it against the storm's progression. She had not made it to her family. He'd sent a discreet inquiry and received a reply that was both confused and frightened, her father clearly unaware of any of this, which meant she hadn't gone to them, which meant she was either unwilling to go back or unable. 3 weeks after the night she'd walked out, Constance Alford left for the continent. Adrian learned this through his network of contacts in the capital. She had told her household she was visiting cousins in France, had packed 4 trunks, had sold 2 pieces of jewelry through a capital broker the week before. The speed and scale of it told him she knew something was coming. Someone in the manor had talked. Someone had let it slip that the Duke was asking questions. He sent a man after her. Not to stop her. He had no legal mechanism yet, nothing formalized. But to follow and document and wait. He would have what he needed eventually. The conspiracy, once he started pulling at it, had more threads than he'd expected. Constance had not acted alone, had clearly had access to resources beyond her own means, had been connected to at least 2 other noble families with interests in destabilizing the Blackthorne line. All of this was information. All of it was progress. None of it was the thing he was actually looking for. The thing he was actually looking for was not found. Not in winter, with the roads hard and the villages close-mouthed and the northern counties locked under snow. Not in early spring, When the thaw opened the roads again and his riders extended their range and came back with rumors and misdirections, and one genuinely promising lead in a village near the coast that turned out to be a different woman entirely, younger, unmarried, nothing like her except the dark hair and the way she held herself straight. In February, a report reached him that a woman believed to be the Duchess of Blackthorne had been sheltered by a family in the northern counties and had given birth to a daughter in the late winter. The report was 3 weeks old by the time it arrived and contained no location specific enough to act on. He stood in his study and read the report, and the word daughter did something to him that he would not have predicted and could not adequately describe. Not relief exactly, though some part of him had been calculating odds and managing the specific dread of what a November storm and an exposed pregnancy might mean. Not the particular dynastic anxiety a man of his position was supposed to feel about an heir who was not a son. Something more immediate and less categorizable than either of those, the word daughter, landing in his chest with the weight of a specific child who existed and was alive and was his, and whom he had never seen, had not been present for, had not, by any reasonable accounting, earned the right to. He set the report down. Outside the study window, Blackthorne Manor's grounds were beginning their cautious return to something like life. The kitchen garden sending up its first tentative green, the stable yard active with the particular noise of spring. The manor was running. It ran efficiently, as it always had, because he had built its systems to operate without requiring constant intervention. The tenant disputes were managed, the accounts were current, the political obligations were met. The manor was running, and it was empty in a way it had not been before she came, and he had not permitted himself to think about that directly either, and he was running out of capacity to not think about things. He crossed to the window. Same window. He seemed to live at this window now. He had, in the past 4 months, sent her family a formal communication that described the situation in terms that protected her reputation without fully explaining the circumstances. He had blocked, through careful and expensive legal maneuvering, the worst of the court gossip about her disappearance. Not successfully enough. The rumors had circulated regardless. But he had contained them to a version that framed her absence as a health matter rather than an expulsion. He had done these things efficiently and without fanfare and told himself they were restitution, told himself they were the actions of a man correcting a mistake. They were not restitution. They were maintenance. Restitution required finding her. He turned from the window and called for his horse. He rode north himself for the first time in March. Not with a retinue. 2 men only, men he trusted completely, men who understood that this journey was not conducted under the Blackthorne banner and would not be discussed. He rode the northern counties for 11 days, stopping at physicians' households and coaching inns and the kinds of charitable institutions that a woman with no other options might have known to look for. And he asked his questions carefully, in language that would not immediately identify who was asking or why. On the 8th day, in a village he had not expected to be significant, a woman at the dry goods counter looked at him with the specific careful blankness of someone who knew exactly what he was asking about and had decided, in the half-second before she answered, how much to give him. "There was a woman," she said, "came through in the winter, staying with the Ashford place, up the North Hill." "Was," he said. "She moved on. Come spring." The woman turned to rearrange something on the shelf behind her that didn't need rearranging. "Took her baby and went." "Where?" A pause. The woman looked at the shelf. "I couldn't say." He looked at her, at the back of her head, the deliberate performance of her disinterest, and understood that she could, in fact, say, and had decided not to, and that this decision was itself a piece of information. Someone had prepared this town. Someone had made arrangements, or had earned sufficient loyalty that the local population of this particular village had made their own arrangements to protect a woman who had passed through it 7 months ago. He rode to the Ashford place. The man who answered the door was old and white-haired, and looked at Adrian with the calm, measuring attention of someone who had seen enough difficult things that another one, even one arriving on a well-bred horse with the bearing of a man accustomed to obedience, did not substantially rearrange his understanding of the world. "You'd be the husband," Nathaniel Ashford said. "I need to know where she is." "I expect you do." The old man leaned against his doorframe and looked him over with the unhurried attention of someone conducting a specific kind of assessment. "She told me about you. Considerable amount, over a winter." Adrian said nothing. "She never asked me to hide her location from anyone." A pause. "She didn't need to. I made that decision myself." Another pause, longer. "She's doing well. The baby's well. That's what you want to know first, I'd have thought, but you haven't asked." The words landed with a precision that was clearly intentional. "The baby is well," Adrian said. "Thriving. Strong child." Ashford looked at him steadily. "She named her Clara." Something moved in Adrian's chest. He kept his face still. "I need her location." "I know you do." Ashford was quiet for a moment. "I'll tell you where she is, but I'll tell you something else first, and you'll hear it, because she won't say it herself. She's too busy being the person she's become in the last 8 months, which is considerably more than she was when you sent her out into that storm, and she won't waste what she's built on grievance." He pushed off the doorframe and stood straight. "But I was a physician for 30 years, and I saw what she looked like when she got to my door, and I spent a winter watching what your decision did to a woman who was already carrying your child. And if you are here because you have understood that you were wrong, then I'll give you the location, and I'll wish you luck, and I'll mean it. And if you're here for any other reason—" "I was wrong," Adrian said. Ashford looked at him, a long look, the kind that didn't require a response because it was doing its own work, taking its own measure. "Coastal road north of Fenwick," he said. "There's a widow's cottage, blue door, half a mile past the old mill. She's been there since April." Adrian turned his horse. "She's not going to be glad to see you," Ashford said behind him. Adrian didn't answer. He already knew. What he didn't know, what he was only beginning to understand as he rode north with the spring wind in his face and the specific weight of 8 months of wrong sitting in his chest, was that the woman waiting at the end of that coastal road was not the woman he had sent into the storm. That woman was gone. What the storm had done, what the winter had done, what 8 months of building a life from almost nothing had done, was burn away everything about Vivian Hale that had ever needed anything from him. The woman with the blue door had already survived him. The question, the only real question, was what he was going to do when he found out that the hardest part was not finding her. The hardest part was standing in front of someone who no longer needed you and asking to matter anyway. The blue door was exactly where Ashford had said it would be. Adrian sat on his horse at the crest of the coastal road and looked down at the cottage for a long moment before he descended. It was a small place, solid, the kind of structure that had been built without pretension by people who understood that the sea wind required honesty in construction. A kitchen garden along the south wall, recently worked. A line of washing that the wind was making emphatic. Smoke from the chimney that meant someone was home, and the fire had been lit recently, which meant the morning was already in motion inside. He had rehearsed nothing. He had told himself, during the 11 days of riding, that he would know what to say when he arrived, that the words would organize themselves in the presence of the actual situation. He understood now, looking down at the blue door, that this had been a convenient lie he had told himself to avoid the task of preparation, which was itself avoidance of a more fundamental problem. There were no words adequate to this situation, and the attempt to find them was its own form of insult, the insult of a man who believed that the right combination of language could resolve what had been done with language in the first place. He dismounted, tied the horse to the fence post, walked to the door. He knocked. The sound from inside stopped. A particular stopping, the kind that meant the sound had not simply paused but had been paused, deliberately, by someone who had heard the knock and was now deciding. He stood on the step and waited, and the sea wind worked at the back of his coat, and the silence stretched long enough that he understood she already knew who was on the other side. The door opened. Vivian looked at him. She was thinner in the face than he remembered. Not unhealthy, something more refined than that. The particular leanness of a person who had been stripped of everything non-essential and had not bothered to rebuild the non-essential parts. She was wearing a plain wool dress the color of slate, her hair pinned back without ceremony, and she was holding Clara against her left shoulder with the unconscious competence of someone for whom the weight had become native. The baby was asleep. 4 months old, dark-haired, her face turned against Vivian's neck. Vivian looked at him the way Ashford had predicted, not with the anger he had braced for, not with the grief he had half expected and half dreaded, but with the expression of a person who had already done the accounting, who had already run the scene in her head through multiple iterations and arrived at a place of such complete prior processing that his actual physical presence was almost redundant information. She was not glad to see him. She was not devastated to see him either. She was simply present, looking at him, waiting. "Vivian," he said. "I know why you're here," she said. "Come in if you're going to." Was. The cottage's interior was small and arranged with a precision that told him more than she probably intended. Everything had a place, everything was where it needed to be. The deliberate order of someone who had learned to treat a small space as a form of control over a world that had recently demonstrated how little control was guaranteed. There was a cradle near the fire, a small writing desk by the window with papers that she turned face down when she saw him looking, a kitchen table with 2 chairs. She put Clara in the cradle with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, adjusted the blanket, and then stood and turned and looked at him with her arms at her sides. "The marriage contract," he said. "The handwriting." "You found it." 6 days after, he watched her face. "You knew it was there." "I realized it was there 2 months after I left." A pause. "I spent some time deciding whether to send you a letter about it." "You decided not to." "I decided," she said carefully, "that if you were the kind of man who would throw his pregnant wife into a November storm based on forged evidence, then whether you discovered the truth yourself was going to tell me something important about what kind of man you actually were." Her voice was even, the words placed with the care of someone who had prepared this speech without intending to deliver it, and was now delivering it anyway because it was the truest thing available. "It took you 8 months." "I sent writers. 8 months," she said again, not raising her voice. Not accusing, simply establishing the number as a permanent feature of the landscape between them. He had no answer for that. She crossed to the fire and adjusted the grate in a way that didn't need adjusting, and he recognized the gesture, the small, busy motion of a person who needed a moment that wasn't being looked at. When she turned back, her face had closed over something. "Constance Alford," she said, "fled to the continent in January. I have a man on her." He paused. She wasn't alone. There were 2 other families involved, the Hargrove connection and someone inside the Capitol Administrative Office who was feeding information. "I have documentation on most of it. The royal court will get the documentation." She nodded once. Not surprised. "And you expect that to matter to me?" "I expect it to be a beginning." She looked at him for a long moment. Clara made a small sound in the cradle, not waking, just the brief vocal commentary of a sleeping infant, and Vivian's attention went to her automatically and then returned to him. "She has your eyes," Vivian said, the information delivered flatly, without warmth or invitation. "In case you were wondering." Something went through his chest. He managed to keep it off his face. Barely. "I'd like to," he started. "Not yet," she said. "Sit down." He sat. Awed. She told him what the winter had been. Not all of it. Not the first night at Ashford's, not the specific quality of the cold, not the 2 weeks in early January when Clara had been ill with a fever that had not been dangerous but had felt, at 3 a.m, like the most dangerous thing in the world. But enough. She told it plainly, without performance, and he sat at the kitchen table and listened and did not interrupt, which cost him more than she would know, because the instinct to say something, to insert himself into the narrative, to do the thing powerful men did when confronted with damage they had caused and could not fully sit still inside, was significant. He sat still. When she finished, she looked at him and said, "What do you want?" "I want you to come back to Blackthorne Manor." "No." The word was immediate and complete, the sound of a door that had been thoroughly latched. "Vivian, I am not going back to Blackthorne Manor as the woman who was thrown out of it." She said it quietly, and it was the quietest sentence she had said since he arrived, and therefore the most load-bearing. "I understand what you're offering. I understand you believe you're making restitution, and I am prepared to believe, that you have spent 8 months in something like genuine remorse." Her eyes held his steadily. But remorse is not trust. And I don't trust you. He said nothing. I don't trust you, she said again. And I have a daughter now, and she is 4 months old, and she will not grow up watching her mother be managed. I'm not asking you to be managed. You are asking me to come back to a house where I have no ground of my own, under circumstances where your remorse is the entire foundation of my security, and where the moment your remorse fades, or your certainty reasserts itself, or someone else puts something in front of you that looks like evidence, I am back in the same position. Her voice was still even. That was the worst part of it, the evenness. You don't get to ask me to bet everything I've built on a feeling you're having right now. He was quiet for a long time. Then tell me what you do need, he said. She opened her mouth and then stopped. Later, he would think about that pause, the way her expression had changed in it, the way something moved across her face that was not the controlled neutrality of everything she'd said before. Something real, something that had been prepared to respond to argument, prepared to handle pressure and persuasion and the various forms of ducal authority, and had not prepared itself for tell me what you need delivered in that register, without strategy behind it. She said, I need time. You have it. I need... She stopped again, looked at Clara, who was still sleeping with the absolute commitment that only very young things bring to sleep. I need to not be afraid that you'll change your mind. I won't. You don't get to just say that. I know, he said. I know I don't. I'm saying it anyway, because it's the only thing I have right now that's true, and I would rather say a true thing you don't believe than a careful thing you might. The fire moved in the grate. Outside, the sea wind worked at the cottage walls with its low, patient insistence. She looked at him with the expression of a woman trying to determine whether what she was hearing was real or whether she was pattern matching toward something she still, underneath all of it, wanted to be real. And the effort of that determination was visible on her face for one unguarded moment before she pulled it back. Give me 2 weeks, she said. He stayed in the village. He did not push. He came to the cottage each morning and was useful in the limited ways she permitted, mended the fence post that had been loose since March, hauled water on the day the pump was stiff, sat at the kitchen table while she worked and said very little, and watched Clara with a focus that he tried to make undemanding. Clara, for her part, regarded him with the solemn and unsentimental attention of a 4-month-old for whom every new face was primarily a data collection exercise. She did not cry at him. He took this as a form of provisional absolution. On the 6th day, Vivian let him hold her. He held his daughter for the first time in a chair by the cottage window with the sea visible in the distance, and Vivian watching from across the room with her arms crossed, and an expression he couldn't fully read. And Clara looked up at him with his own eyes in a face that was Vivian's face in miniature, and the mathematics of it, of what he had almost lost, of what a single November night had nearly permanently removed from the world, did something to him that he had no framework for and did not try to name. He held her and said nothing and looked at the sea. That was the 6th day. On the 8th day, they came. He heard it first, the sound of horses on the coastal road, more than 2, moving with the purposeful pace of a group that knew its destination. He was outside at the fence when it registered, and the registration happened in his body before his mind had fully processed the information, the specific animal alertness of a man who had spent his adult life in political environments where arrival could mean very different things. He counted 4 horses, riders he didn't recognize, 1 carriage behind them, unmarked, the kind of unmarked that was itself a declaration. His 2 men materialized at his side without being called. Get inside, he said quietly. Tell her to take the baby to the back room. Don't open the door. He walked toward the road. The riders stopped 20 feet from him. The one in front was young, well-dressed in a way that was almost theatrical, the peacocking of someone who had been given authority recently and was still calibrating how to wear it. He looked at Adrian with the expression of a man who had been told he would be meeting the Duke of Blackthorne and was engaged in the task of deciding how intimidated to be. He decided not very. Your Grace, he said, with the courtesy that wasn't. Lord Marcus Hargrove's compliments. Adrian looked at him, said nothing. Lord Hargrove extends his concern for the welfare of the child. The writer paused, savoring the weight of what came next. Given the question of legitimate succession and the current, irregular circumstances of the Duchess's residence, Lord Hargrove believes it may be prudent for the child to be temporarily housed at— No, Adrian said. The writer blinked, adjusted. Your Grace, Lord Hargrove has documentation suggesting that the paternity of the child may be— Those documents are forgeries, Adrian said. The same network that produced them is currently the subject of a royal court inquiry that Lord Hargrove is also a named party to, which I suspect Lord Hargrove knows. He let that land. And the documentation of his involvement is in the hands of 3 separate legal parties who have instructions about what to do with it if anything happens to me or to my family. A pause. The writer's certainty had developed a quality of reassessment. Lord Hargrove sent 4 riders and a carriage to a widow's cottage on the coast to take a 4-month-old child from her mother. Adrian's voice had gone very quiet and very flat, the register he used when he had finished with preliminary stages. Lord Hargrove should have sent more. The sound of the cottage door. He didn't turn around. He held the rider's eyes. Vivian came to stand at his left shoulder. He heard her, felt the specific weight of her presence, heard Clara making small sounds against her neck. She had come outside with the baby in her arms, and he didn't know whether to be furious at the exposure or whether he had already understood on some level below planning that this was what she would do, that the woman who had walked into a November storm rather than accept the version of herself being handed to her was not a woman who would be moved to a back room. The writer looked at her. His eyes moved to the child. "Get off this road," Vivian said. She said it the way she had said no to Adrian's request to return to the manor. Complete, latched, final. She said it with Clara held against her chest, and the sea wind in her hair, and the expression of someone who had been through things that recalibrated the scale on which she measured threats. The writer looked at her, looked at Adrian, looked at the 2 men standing behind them both, who had the particular stillness of professionals. He looked back at his own riders, who were doing the arithmetic. Something went out of the confrontation. Not the danger. That was still present, still real, still a calculation being made somewhere behind the young rider's composed expression. But the immediate version of it deflated in the face of what was standing in front of it, and after a long moment the rider inclined his head and turned his horse, and the group moved back up the coastal road with the specific dignity of a retreat being conducted as slowly as possible. Adrian watched until they were gone. Then he turned and looked at Vivian. She was still holding Clara. Her face was pale but not frightened, something past frightened, or beneath it, the expression of a person who has just understood the full scope of what they are standing inside. Her eyes met his, and he saw in them the specific recalculation happening in real time. This was not over. Hargrove had sent riders knowing Adrian was here, knowing the documentation existed, which meant Hargrove had decided that speed mattered more than subtlety, which meant something had changed in the capital, something that made the timeline urgent, which meant they were not safe here, which meant— "How many families?" she said. "How many are involved?" "At least 3, possibly 4. And Constance?" "Still on the continent, but she wouldn't have needed to be here for this." Vivian looked down at Clara, who had fallen asleep again through the entire confrontation with the magnificent indifference of the very young. She looked at her daughter's face for a moment with an expression that had no name in the vocabulary of anything he'd prepared for. Then she looked at him. "I need you to tell me everything," she said. "All of it. Every name, every document, every piece of information you have." A pause, and what came with it was the sound of something being decided that had been in the process of being decided for 8 months. The sound of a woman who had done the accounting and was now acting on the result. "And then we are going to Blackthorne Manor." He looked at her. "Not because you asked me to," she said. "Because Clara needs walls that can be defended, and because the people trying to take her think I'm still the woman who can be moved by force." Something crossed her face. Not anger, something older and more structural than anger. "I need them to find out otherwise." He said, "On your terms." "On my terms," she said. "Every condition I name." "Yes." She looked at him for one more long moment, measuring something she didn't name. Then she turned and carried Clara back toward the door. "Get your horse," she said over her shoulder. "We leave in the morning." He stood on the coastal road in the sea wind and understood something that had not been clear to him before. Not through 8 months of searching, not through the archive room at 2 in the morning, not through any of the careful work of restitution he had conducted in the dark. He understood it now, standing in front of a cottage with a blue door while the woman inside made her preparations, that she was not coming back because he had found her, or because he had been right about the forgery, or because remorse had accumulated to a sufficient weight. She was coming back because she had decided to. Because she had decided she was strong enough to go back and not be the same person who had left. And because the threat pressing against her daughter's life was real, and the walls of Blackthorne Manor were stone and 3 feet thick, and because she had looked at the rider on the coastal road and felt in herself the absolute absence of the fear that used to live there. She was not returning to his house. She was walking into it on her own feet, on her own terms, with her daughter on her shoulder and the full knowledge that the people who had tried to destroy her from the inside had not in fact finished with them yet. And somewhere in the capital, Lord Marcus Hargrove was already being informed that the rider had returned empty-handed. And the fact of her survival, and her return, and the stone walls of Blackthorne Manor preparing to receive her, that was not a comfort to him. That was the beginning of a problem he had badly miscalculated. Blackthorne Manor received them on a gray morning with the sky the color of old iron, and the grounds quiet in the way that felt less like peace than like held breath. Vivian rode through the front gate with Clara strapped against her chest in the wool carrier Eleanor had taught her to make during the long winter months, and she looked at the manor's stone face, all those windows, all that controlled architecture, the building's entire grammar of power and enclosure, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Nothing. Not the old fear, not the visceral recoil she had anticipated, not even the layered grief of the woman who had walked out of this place in a storm. The manor was stone. Stone could be managed. She had learned, over the course of 1 winter and 1 spring and 1 summer of building a life out of almost nothing, that stone was actually one of the more manageable things. What could not be managed, she knew now, was people. People with plans. People with patience and money and the specific ruthlessness of those who believed inheritance was a war and every tool available was legitimate. She had 4 days before she understood how right she was. Unnamed. The household received her with the careful correctness of a staff that had spent nearly a year navigating the particular tension of an absent duchess, and a duke who had spent most of that absence doing something that looked like penance. Mrs. Pryor met her at the door with the expression of a woman who had things to say and had decided this was not the moment, and showed her to the rooms that had been prepared. Not the Duchess's suite she had occupied before, but a larger set of rooms on the east wing that looked over the garden, with a connecting nursery and a sitting room that had clearly been arranged by someone who had thought carefully about what a woman returning on her own terms might need. She stood in the sitting room and looked at it. Adrian appeared in the doorway. "If any of it needs to be changed, it's fine," she said. Not warmly, but not coldly either. The neutrality of someone deferring judgment until there was more information. He nodded and left. She gave him credit for leaving. Over those first 4 days, she relearned the house. She walked its corridors in the early morning before Clara woke, mapping it the way she had learned to map everything in the past year. Not as architecture, but as a system, tracking the movement of staff, the patterns of access, the places where the house was permeable, and the places where it held. She reintroduced herself to the tenant representatives with the specific directness of a woman who no longer had the time or inclination for the management of other people's comfort at the expense of her own clarity. She sat in on the estate business meetings Adrian held 3 times a week with his steward and said nothing, only listened, building her understanding of the financial and political architecture of what she had returned to. Adrian watched her do this. She was aware of him watching. She did not adjust her behavior to account for it. On the 4th evening, he came to the sitting room door and said, "Hargrove has filed a formal petition with the royal court, questioning Clara's legitimacy." She had been expecting this. On what grounds? The standard grounds: duration of our separation, absence of witness conjugal. He stopped. "It's not a petition that will succeed. I have the documentation, the court timeline." "He doesn't need it to succeed," she said. He needs it to take long enough that the uncertainty creates room to move. She looked at him. What does he actually want? The northern land grants. 3 parcels that Clara's legitimacy controls the inheritance of. Without a confirmed heir, they revert to the crown, and Hargrove has a purchase agreement with the crown already drafted. She absorbed this. He planned this before we married. Before I married, yes. The original plan was probably that I wouldn't marry at all, or would marry a woman without complications. Something moved in his jaw. When I married you and you became pregnant, the plan required modification. And Constance was the modification. Constance was the tool. Hargrove was the architect. A pause. I underestimated him. I knew he was opposed to my position at court, and I managed him accordingly, but I did not. He stopped again. The quality of the stop was different from his usual controlled pauses. This one had something raw underneath it. I treated him like a political opponent. I should have treated him like a threat. She looked at him for a moment. You can't run your entire life treating everyone like a threat. I know. You did it with me, she said. In the study. You treated me like a threat the moment those letters appeared. She said it without heat, the way you state a fact about weather. That's what happens when you build everything on suspicion. Eventually, you aim it at the wrong person. He held her gaze, did not flinch. Yes. Fix the petition first, she said. Then we'll talk about Hargrove. The petition took 6 days and required Adrian's personal appearance before the royal court's family chamber, where he presented the documentation of Constance's access to the receiving room, the comparative handwriting analysis, and the marriage contract with Vivian's left-handed signature. He presented it with the controlled precision of a man who had been preparing this case for months, and the chamber found against the petition within 48 hours. Vivian learned of this from Mrs. Pryor, not from Adrian, which told her the information network she'd had as Duchess before was still at least partially intact. She was in the nursery with Clara when Mrs. Pryor appeared in the doorway and delivered the information with the compressed satisfaction of someone who had been waiting a long time to say it. Good, Vivian said. Clara grabbed at her finger. Vivian let her keep it. And Hargrove's response? Mrs. Pryor's expression shifted. One of the kitchen girls said she saw a man she didn't recognize in the east corridor yesterday evening. She thought he was a new footman. He wasn't. Vivian looked at her. I didn't tell His Grace yet, Mrs. Pryor said. Tell him now. She went back to Clara, who had no opinions yet about petitions or land grants, or the presence of unrecognized men in east corridors, and held her daughter with both arms and let the clean animal certainty of that holding be real for a moment. Then she put Clara down and went to find Adrian. Bobden. She found him in the stable yard with Thomas, his head man, both of them looking at something on the ground near the east gate. She crossed the yard and looked at it too, a length of rope with a specific kind of knot, the type used to tether a horse to a moving vehicle, left deliberately where it would be found. Adrian looked at her over it. His face had the quality she recognized from the coastal road, assessment running faster than expression. How many men do you have inside the manor? She said. 4 I trust completely. 6 more I trust conditionally. He said it quickly, no hesitation. This, at least, they had already become efficient at. The direct exchange of operational information, the brief military language that had developed between them in the 2 weeks since the cottage. But if someone is already inside, someone is already inside, she said. Mrs. Pryor saw him, East Corridor, last night. Thomas swore under his breath. Adrian looked at the rope. Something was working behind his eyes. She could see the architecture of it, the way he built threat assessments, rapid and structural, the thing he was actually very good at when he wasn't pointing it at her. They're not coming tonight, he said. This is a marker. They're telling us they can be inside. They can be here. They want us to know it. He paused. Which means they want us to move. Move Clara. Move any of us. If we move Clara, we establish that we think she's the target and we lose her from defensible ground. If we move at all, we're choosing a route, and a route can be anticipated. He looked at her. They want us to run. Then we don't run, she said. He looked at her for a beat longer than necessary. Something shifted in his face, small but visible. No, he said. We don't. The attack came on the seventh night after their return. It did not come from outside. That was the part that rewrote everything, that landed with the specific quality of a blow you had technically been told was coming, but still could not quite prepare your body for. It did not come through the gates or over the walls or through any of the external access points that Thomas and his men had spent a week reinforcing. It came through James. James Whitmore, Adrian's personal secretary, who had been with the Blackthorne household for 9 years, who managed the Duke's correspondence and knew the interior schedule of the manor down to the specific timing of the night watch rotations, who had keys to the east corridor and the nursery connecting passage, and who had, it turned out, debts of a size that made Lord Marcus Hargrove's money look like salvation rather than corruption. Vivian was awake when it happened. She had not been sleeping well since returning to the manor. Not fear exactly, more the specific insomnia of a body that had recalibrated its threat threshold and was now running continuously on a lower setting of alert. She was in the sitting room with a candle and the household account books when she heard Clara, not crying. Clara had a specific sound she made when she was being lifted by unfamiliar hands, a questioning high note, the sound of a baby experiencing something that didn't match the expected pattern. Vivian had learned this sound over 4 months of absolute attentiveness to this specific small person. She was through the connecting door before she had finished processing what she'd heard. James was at the cradle. Clara was in his arms. He turned when Vivian came through the door, and his face did the thing that faces do when a plan meets a variable it hadn't included. A rapid, involuntary recalculation, there and gone, replaced with something harder. "Don't," Vivian said. "Step back," James said. His voice was unsteady. The instability of it was its own warning. A frightened man holding a baby was more dangerous than a confident one. "This doesn't have to. Put her down." Vivian crossed the room at a pace that was not a run, but covered the distance with the specific purpose of something that has narrowed its entire world to one point. "James, put her down right now." "I can't." His arms tightened around Clara, who made the questioning sound again, louder. "I can't. I'm sorry. If I don't bring her—" Something broke in his voice. "I owe Hargrove money I can't repay. My family, my mother's tenancy." "I know," Vivian said, and she said it with a gentleness that surprised even her. The completely real gentleness of a woman who understood exactly what it meant to be leveraged into an impossible corner, who recognized in his face the specific expression of a person who had been given no good options and had chosen the least terrible one. "I know, and I am telling you, James, that whatever Hargrove has threatened, the thing you are doing right now is the thing you cannot come back from. Put her down and there is a path forward. There isn't one if you walk out that door." His hands were shaking. Clara started to cry in earnest now. The door behind Vivian opened. Adrian came through it at the wrong speed, not cautiously, which told her he had heard enough from the corridor to have already assessed the situation and decided that caution was not the tool. He took in James, Clara, the shaking hands in one single look, and went very still in the way that she had learned, over 2 years of studying him, was his most dangerous register. Not the cold pronouncements of the study, not the controlled fury of the political arena, but this, the absolute stillness of a man who had identified what needed to happen and was deciding the fastest path. "Give me my daughter," he said. The simplicity of it landed in the room differently than anything else that had been said. No threat in it, no authority, nothing that sounded like the Duke of Blackthorne issuing a directive. Just a man saying a sentence that contained the entire content of what he was. James looked at him. Something went out of James's face. Not will exactly. Something more total, some foundational weight-bearing element of the entire construction he'd built to get himself into this room and this moment. He looked at Adrian, and the shaking got worse, and he looked down at Clara, who was crying with her fists clenched and her face red, and Vivian watched him understand in real time that he had been sold a version of this situation that did not include the actual weight of a child in his hands. He held her out. Adrian crossed to him in 4 steps and took Clara, turned away from James immediately, turning his back on him with complete deliberateness, making the specific choice to not be a threat while Thomas appeared in the doorway behind James and made it unnecessary. He carried Clara to Vivian and put her in her arms, and Clara's crying shifted register, still upset but immediately oriented, moving her face against Vivian's neck with the instinct of something finding its true north. Vivian held her and looked at Adrian over her daughter's head. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. There was a cut along his jaw she hadn't seen in the dim light of the nursery that was bleeding freely enough to suggest it had happened recently, in the corridor outside, which meant James had not come alone, which meant the exterior penetration had been simultaneous. "How many?" she said. "3 outside." He reached up and touched the cut on his jaw as though just discovering it. "Thomas has them." "Hargrove." "Not here himself." He looked at James, who was standing with Thomas's hand on his shoulder with the collapsed expression of a man who has run out of all of his options simultaneously. "He never puts himself where the risk is," James said, in a voice that had gone thin and stripped. "There's a ship. At the harbor. They have men there. If I didn't bring the child by midnight—" "How many men?" Adrian said. 6. A pause. "Maybe 8. Hargrove wanted—" James stopped. The muscle in his throat moved. "He wanted the child and he wanted Lady Vivian. He said, with both of them, the legal case against the legitimacy couldn't be countered, and with the Duchess absent again—" He couldn't finish it. Vivian looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at her. The harbor. Midnight. 8 men and a ship and a man who had been planning this for years and had just run his most sophisticated play and had come 3 minutes from succeeding because of a sound only Vivian knew to listen for. "Clara stays here," Vivian said, "with Mrs. Pryor and 2 of your most trusted men, in the room with the heaviest lock." She held his gaze. "And we go to the harbor. Vivian, they're expecting James to deliver me." She said it with the evenness that had been her primary register since the cottage, the one that she had built over 8 months and that did not waver under pressure. "They're not expecting me to arrive on my own feet with the Duke of Blackthorne." A beat of silence. The candle on the nursery table guttered in a draft. "This isn't—" he started. "I know what it is," she said. "I've known what it is since a man on a horse came to a cottage with a blue door and told me Hargrove sent his compliments. It's a war, and he has been fighting it for years while we were managing everything else, and it doesn't end until it ends." She looked at Clara, who had gone quiet against her shoulder, exhausted from the crying, already sliding back towards sleep with the magnificent resilience of the very young. "And it ends tonight." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. The cut on his jaw was still bleeding. His shirt was torn. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who was not managing the situation from a position of prepared strength, but was standing inside it with whatever he actually had. He looked, for the first time, like someone she recognized as real. "You don't have to come," he said. "I know," she said. She handed Clara to Mrs. Pryor, who had appeared with the impeccable timing of 20 years of household instinct, and she looked at her daughter's sleeping face for one moment, the clean animal-specific love of it landing in her chest like something that sharpened everything it touched. Then she turned to Adrian and said, "Let's finish it." They went out through the manor's east gate into the dark, and the harbor was 2 miles down the cliff road, and somewhere below them the sea was working at the rocks with its cold, patient insistence, and Hargrove's men were waiting at a ship that was supposed to be carrying away everything Adrian Blackthorne had left in the world. The cliff road was narrow and the wind was up, and in the darkness ahead of them, a lantern moved. Next, the harbor, the cliffs, the final confrontation that will determine whether everything Vivian rebuilt and everything Adrian is willing to sacrifice is enough to end it for good. This is a work of complete fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and circumstances depicted are entirely imaginary. Set. The lantern moved again, lower on the cliff path, and Adrian put his hand out to stop her without touching her. Just the gesture, the flat palm in her peripheral vision, and they both went still on the road and listened. 2 sets of footsteps below. The creak of rigging from the harbor. The sea doing its permanent work on the rocks, indifferent to all of it. "They have a man on the path," he said very quietly. "I see him." "There'll be another at the dock gate." He studied the darkness below with the focus of someone reading a language. "They're expecting James to come down alone with the child. One man on the path, the rest at the ship. They won't be watching the cliff approach from the north side." She looked at the cliff face to their right. The north approach was not a path. It was a descent that required both hands and the specific willingness to trust stone that might or might not hold. She looked at him. "I've done it before," he said. It was not a boast. It was the flat factual statement of a man who had grown up on this coastline and had done things in his youth that the Duke of Blackthorne was not supposed to have done. 15 years ago, but the rock doesn't change. "Then go," she said. He looked at her. The cut on his jaw had slowed to a dark line in the moonlight. "You take the path. Stay in the shadow of the gorse line. When the man with the lantern turns toward the dock, and he will turn, he'll be watching for James coming from the manor direction. You move past him. And then? And then you stay behind me," he said, and the words carried a weight that was not command and was not request, but something that existed in the space between them that had been building since a cottage with a blue door, something that neither of them had named and that didn't require naming to be completely real. "Vivian, stay behind me." She held his gaze for one moment. "Don't die," she said. He moved toward the cliff face without answering, which was itself a kind of answer, and she turned to the path. None. The man with the lantern was young and cold and bored in the particular combination that made people careless, and he turned toward the dock at precisely the moment Adrian had predicted. Some signal from below. A low whistle that meant nothing to Vivian, but clearly meant something to the network of men Hargrove had positioned along this approach. She moved through the gorse shadow with the specific economy of someone who had learned, over the past year, to take up exactly as much space as necessary and no more. And she was past him and down the lower path before he turned back. The harbor was small, a working dock, 3 vessels, the smell of salt and old wood, and the particular cold of water that never fully warmed. Hargrove's ship was the middle one, a mid-sized merchant vessel that had been modified, she could see even in the dark, for faster running, lighter rigging, different ballast line. A ship designed to move quickly and not be followed. 6 men on the dock. She counted them twice. 1 at the gangway, 2 mid-dock, 3 near the harbor master's shed. Armed, but not in the posture of men expecting a fight. In the posture of men waiting for a delivery. She was looking for Adrian on the cliff approach when the harbor master's shed door opened. Lord Marcus Hargrove stepped out. She had met him 4 times during her time as duchess, at court functions where he had been precisely, surgically courteous, the particular courtesy of a man who considers it a tactical instrument. He was 60, heavy-set, with the look of someone who had been physically powerful in his youth and had converted it, over decades, into a different kind of mass. He stood on the dock and looked toward the cliff path with the expression of a man checking a timetable. Then he looked directly at her. She had not been as concealed as she thought. "Lady Vivian," he said, the courtesy reflex even now. "This is unexpected." She stepped out of the shadow because there was nothing to be gained by staying in it. "Lord Hargrove." The 6 men had turned. She heard the dock shift, the particular sound of weight redistributing as they reoriented. "James had trouble," she said. "Evidently." He looked at her with the assessing calm of someone running an adjustment calculation. "And the child? Is at the manor." Something moved in his face. Not surprise exactly. Recalibration, the shift of a chess player whose opponent has deviated from the anticipated line. "You came without the child," he said, "and without your husband." He looked at the path behind her. "Brave, or foolish." "I came to tell you it's over," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then, to her precise fury, he smiled. Not the court smile. Something more real, the smile of a man who had been in this kind of conversation before and found its conventions tiresome. "My dear," he said, with the specific condescension of a man who had moved pieces on boards for 40 years and was entirely comfortable with how this one resolved, "nothing is over. Your husband's documentation exists, yes, And the petition failed, and James will have talked by morning. I am aware of all of this. He took 2 steps toward her, not threatening, the measured pace of a man making a point. But you are standing on a dock at midnight without the child, which means the child is at the manor, which means I have 6 men here, and however many at the manor, and your husband is... He glanced at the cliff face with something that was almost appreciation. Somewhere on that cliff, I would imagine, trying to come at us from the north. He tilted his head. He always did prefer the theatrical approach. You've known him a long time, she said, since he was 12. Something shifted in his face, a brief passage of something more complex. I was a close associate of his father's. A pause. His father was a practical man. Adrian was always the complication. She understood, in that moment, with the particular clarity that came from a year of learning to read what people were actually saying underneath what they said, she understood that this was not simply about land grants, that it had never been simply about land grants, that there was something older here, something that predated her and predated Adrian's dukedom, and lived in the 20 years of history between this man and the family he was trying to dismantle. You couldn't control him, she said. Hargrove's expression did the thing that confirmed it. I could have helped him, he said, and the word helped carried 40 years of a specific relationship in it. His father understood how things worked. Adrian decided he didn't need to understand anything he didn't choose to. Closed every door I opened, refused every alliance, built his entire position on the premise that he could operate outside the network entirely, and he stopped, pulled the surface back over whatever had been showing. It doesn't matter. It does, she said. Because you've spent years destroying his family over a grudge dressed up as strategy, and now you're standing on a dock at midnight, and the documentation is already with the royal court, and James has talked, and you have nowhere left to go. She looked at him steadily. So whatever you're planning to do with those 6 men, I need you to think very carefully about what it gets you. Something moved behind his eyes. The cliff. The sound of rock. Adrian dropped from the north face onto the dock 10 feet to Hargrove's left and landed in a controlled fall that would have broken something in a less physically honest man, came up with the specific contained momentum of someone who had managed the drop and was already past it, already moving. 3 things happened in the following seconds in an order that Vivian would later reconstruct but could not, in the moment, fully sequence. One of Hargrove's men at the gangway moved toward her. Adrian crossed the dock at a pace that converted the man's movement into a tactical error, and Hargrove himself took 2 steps backward toward the ship. The dock became a very loud and very immediate place. She had no weapon. She had understood this before she came, and had decided it was not the point. She was not here to fight 6 armed men. She was here because Hargrove needed to see her standing upright on his dock. Needed to understand that the woman he had spent a year treating as a piece to be moved had arrived of her own volition and was not moving again. She held her ground and let the chaos resolve around her and trusted, for the first time, the specific quality of competence she had watched Adrian deploy in every difficult situation she had ever seen him in. It was not a long fight. It was not clean either. She heard the impact of it, saw Adrian take a blow to the already damaged shoulder that folded him sideways before he corrected, watched Thomas materialize from the upper dock path with 2 of the manor's men at his back, which meant Thomas had anticipated the harbor and had not waited to be told. The 6 men, caught between Adrian from the north face and Thomas from the path, and the specific arithmetic of a situation that had stopped adding up, made the calculation that men make when personal loyalty runs up against personal survival. 4 of them surrendered. 1 ran and didn't get far. 1 went into the harbor and was fished out, cold and finished. Hargrove had not moved. He was standing at the gangway of his ship, and he was looking at Vivian, not at the men, not at Adrian, who was crossing the dock toward him with blood on his shirt, and his jaw set with the expression she had learned meant every auxiliary system had been shut down, and only the essential ones were running. Hargrove looked at her with the expression of a man making a final accounting. You should have stayed in that cottage, he said. Not with malice, with something almost like regret. I know, she said. That's what everyone expected. Adrian stopped beside her. His shoulder was bad. She could see it in the way he was holding that arm, the compensatory stillness of it. He was breathing hard. He was looking at Hargrove with the 20-year history of whatever this was between them fully present in his face, not managed, not compressed into the controlled architecture she'd spent 2 years learning to read, just there. Marcus, he said, just the name. Everything else that needed to be said was in the specific way he said it, not with fury, not with the cold authority of the Duke, but with the sound of a man closing something that had been open for a very long time. Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Vivian. He looked at the dock with the surrendered men, and Thomas's two with their hands on them, and the harbor doing its cold, permanent work around all of it. He stepped back from the gangway. "Get him on the ship," Adrian said to Thomas. "He goes to the capital, tonight." They walked back up the cliff road in the dark, the two of them, at the pace of people who have used everything available and are running now on the specific fuel that comes after, the stripped-down, very quiet energy of aftermath. Adrian's shoulder needed to be looked at. She said so. "I know," he said. "You took that hit and kept moving. I had reasons to keep moving." She looked at him sideways on the dark road. He was looking forward, his face still carrying the quality of the dock. Not the aftermath of violence exactly, but something more interior, the expression of a man who had just closed a door he'd been standing in front of for 20 years and wasn't sure yet what the room on the other side looked like. "His father," she said. "And yours." A pause, the wind off the sea. "Hargrove was my father's closest associate for 15 years. When my father died, Hargrove expected to be the architecture behind whatever I built. Expected access, influence, the kind of proximity to power that he'd spent his career constructing." A beat. "I shut him out, completely. First thing I did when I took the title. Because you knew what he was. Because I'd watched what he was for 15 years. His voice was flat, the tone of a very old memory that had been handled so many times it had worn smooth. My father was not a good man. Hargrove made him worse. And I decided the first real decision of my dukedom was going to be who didn't have a seat at my table. She was quiet for a moment. "You were right." "I was right, and I was arrogant about it," he said. "I shut him out, and I didn't watch him. I turned my back on a dangerous man because I decided he was dealt with, and he spent 12 years building the thing that almost—" He stopped. Almost ended his line. Almost ended Clara. Almost in November in a storm, had. "You can't watch everyone," she said. "No." A pause. "But I should have watched him." They came over the top of the cliff road and the manor appeared ahead, its windows lit, the east wing showing the specific pattern of lights that meant Mrs. Pryor had kept every lamp burning and was awake and waiting. The sight of it hit her differently than it had 4 days ago. The stone face, all that controlled architecture, the grammar of power and enclosure. It looked, in this light, with this specific exhaustion running through her body, like something else. It looked like the place her daughter was sleeping. That was all. That was sufficient. Clara was asleep. Vivian stood over the cradle for a long time in the dark nursery, not touching, just standing in the specific quality of presence that was its own form of accounting. Here, alive, unchanged by the night, breathing with the absolute commitment of something that had not been required yet to understand that the world contained harbors and cliff roads and men with plans. She would understand eventually. The world would insist on it, as it always did. But not tonight. Adrian appeared in the doorway. His shoulder had been seen to, wrapped, the arm immobilized in a sling that he was wearing with the focused discomfort of a man who found physical limitation philosophically objectionable. He looked at Clara. Something in his face went through a change that was not the managed transitions she had cataloged over 2 years, but something more fundamental, the change of a man whose internal accounting had just been permanently revised. "She didn't wake up," Vivian said quietly. "No. Through all of it." "She's got your constitution," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at Clara with the expression she had first seen in the cottage chair by the window, the one that had no framework, the one he didn't try to name. They stood together in the dark nursery over their sleeping daughter, and the house was quiet around them, and outside the sea was doing its permanent work, and would be doing it long after all of this. Hargrove, the petition, the forged letters, the November storm, all of it, had been reduced to the kind of history that families either told or didn't. "The royal court," she said. "I'll present the full documentation in the morning. Hargrove, the capital connection, Constance's part in all of it." A pause. "It will be public. There will be a period of disruption." "I know. Your reputation will be whatever I make it afterward," she said. "That's how reputation actually works. Whatever is said about me or built around me in the next 6 months, I'll build something else on the other side of it." She looked at Clara. "I've done it before." He was quiet. "The women," she said. "The ones I told you about. The ones I want the East Wing converted for." He had not forgotten. She had named it as one of her conditions in the cottage, and he had agreed, and she had been watching to see whether the agreement would survive the return to the manor and its 100 competing priorities. "The architect is coming Thursday," he said. She looked at him. "Mrs. Pryor gave me a list of preliminary specifications," he said. "3 families initially, based on the current cases she's aware of in the county. There's a question about the funding structure, whether it operates under the dukedom formally or as an independent household charity. I thought that was your decision to make." "Independent," she said immediately. "Independent," he agreed. The nursery was very quiet. Clara's breathing was the steadiest thing in it. Vivian thought about what it meant. Not the project. She understood the project with complete clarity. Had understood it since the first winter at the Ashford house when Eleanor had told her about 3 women in the village who had nowhere to go and no one who had thought to build them somewhere. She thought about what it meant that she was standing in this room, in this house, on the other side of the specific November night that had been designed to be the end of her, and that what she felt was not triumph, was not relief, was something quieter and more structural than either. She thought about the woman who had stood in Adrian's study with her hand on his desk and said, "Tell me what I did to you," and had known, even as she said it, that the answer wasn't coming. She thought about what it had taken to become the woman who had walked through Hargrove's men on a harbor dock at midnight and refused to move. The distance between those 2 women was not time. It was not the things that had happened. It was a series of choices made in very cold and very dark circumstances. The accumulated weight of mornings when the available options were all bad, and she had gotten up anyway and chosen the least terrible one, and then done it again the next morning, and the morning after that, and at some point the choosing had become a different kind of muscle than the one she'd started with. That was the thing nobody told you about surviving something. Not that you came out stronger. That was the story, the clean version that made sense from the outside. The real thing was stranger and more specific. You came out different. You came out someone who knew, in the cellular level, that you had already been through the worst available option and were still standing, and that knowledge rewrote something fundamental about how you moved through every room you walked into afterward. She didn't know if that was strength. She knew it was irreversible. "Adrian," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the specific quality of attention he had, the complete, undivided attention of a man who had learned, somewhere over the past year, that the most dangerous thing he had ever done was to stop paying it. "I don't love you the way I used to," she said. He held her gaze, did not flinch. He had gotten better at not flinching. "I know," he said. "The way I used to was desperate," she said, finding the word carefully. "It was the love of someone who needed the person they were loving to reflect something back, to confirm something. I needed you to be a certain thing because I had put everything I had into the bet that you were." She paused. "That love couldn't survive what happened. It was built on the wrong foundation." "Yes," he said, very quiet. "But," she said, and the words sat between them with the specific weight of everything that had happened since November. "I look at you on that dock, and I look at you in this room, and I look at the architect coming Thursday and Mrs. Pryor's specifications that you actually read." She stopped, let out a slow breath. "I see someone I don't entirely recognize from 2 years ago, and I don't know yet what to do with that." "You don't have to know yet," he said. "I know I don't. I'm telling you anyway." "I understand." "Do you?" He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight from the corridor was the only light in the nursery, and it caught the side of his face and the sling on his shoulder and the cut along his jaw that would leave a scar, and she looked at all of it, the physical evidence of a night that could have gone differently in a dozen specific ways, and felt something that was not love in the old sense and was not trust in the complete sense, and was something that she did not have a clean word for, something that existed in the space that opened up after both of those things had been broken down and rebuilt from simpler materials. "I know what I cost you," he said. It was the most stripped-down thing he had ever said to her. No management of it, no structural framing. "I know I can't pay it back. I know there isn't a version of what I can do that constitutes payment." He looked at Clara, then back at her. "I'm not trying to pay it back. I'm trying to be someone different than the man who sent you out in that storm. Whether that's enough—" He stopped. Let the stop be honest. "I don't know." She looked at him, looked at her daughter, looked at the room that had been prepared with the kind of attention that was its own quiet language, its own form of communication between people who had not yet learned to speak to each other in words. "Spring," she said, "the architect on Thursday, and the East Wing project, and the court proceedings, and—" She turned toward the nursery door. "We'll see what we are on the other side of spring." She said it as she walked past him into the corridor, and his hand caught hers. Briefly, the lightest possible contact, the weight of a question rather than a claim, and she let it be there for the length of 2 steps before she kept walking. It was enough. It was not everything. It was precisely what it was, and she understood it with a clarity that the woman in that study 2 years ago could not have accessed, that the most honest things between people were almost never everything, were almost always exactly this: the partial, the provisional, the forward-facing, the let's find out. She had survived a November storm and a winter and a harbor at midnight. She had built something out of 32 pounds and a wool carrier and an old physician's kitchen fire and her own irreducible refusal to be finished. She had come back to this house on her own feet and her own terms, and she was still standing and her daughter was sleeping in the next room and the East Wing was going to be converted Thursday. She did not need the story to be clean. She needed it to be true. Over the years that followed, Blackthorne Manor changed. Not in its stone, not in its architecture, but in its quality of life. The particular atmosphere of a place shifts when the people inside it shift, when the fundamental agreements between them have been renegotiated on more honest ground. The East Wing became what Vivian had seen for it, a place of protected residency for women without options, funded independently, operated with the specific practicality of someone who understood from the inside what the absence of options felt like. It was not a charitable gesture. It was a structural decision, the decision of a woman who had looked at the gap in the world where she had nearly disappeared and had decided to fill it with something solid. Adrian stood in the courtroom before the full session of the royal court on a morning in late October and presented the documentation of Hargrove's conspiracy with a completeness that left the chamber no procedural exit. He named names. He presented evidence. He submitted, as part of the record, a formal accounting of his own failure, not as a legal requirement, but as a choice. The choice of a man who had decided that the only foundation worth building on was the one that included the honest weight of what he'd gotten wrong. The nobles who had participated in the construction of Vivian's disgrace were stripped of their positions and fined, and in 2 cases imprisoned. Constance Alford was returned from the continent by royal order and faced the chamber's findings with the expression of someone who had known, somewhere underneath all of it, that this was always the available ending. Hargrove was removed from every position he held. He was not imprisoned. There were those who thought this insufficient, and Vivian understood their position, held it herself in certain rooms of herself at certain hours. But he was finished. The network was dismantled. The land grants were confirmed in Clara's name. And the man who had spent 12 years building toward the destruction of a family had to live in the specific aftermath of having failed. That was its own sentence. Ishika. On a spring evening 2 years after the harbor, Vivian was in the manor garden with Clara, who had developed, at age 2, strong and entirely non-negotiable opinions about which flowers she was permitted to destroy, and was currently engaged in a negotiation with a rosebush that the rosebush was not winning. Adrian came out from the east entrance and stood at the garden's edge and watched them. She was aware of him watching the way she had always been aware of him. The specific quality of his attention was unmistakable, had been unmistakable since the first month of their marriage, had simply meant different things at different times. Now it meant what it meant. Clara spotted him and made the sound she made when she spotted him. Not the word yet. The word was still assembling itself in her busy 2-year-old mouth, but the clear precursor to it, the reaching sound, the U sound. And Adrian crossed the garden and picked her up with his good shoulder, the habit of the past 18 months, and held her while she conducted a lengthy and authoritative monologue about the rosebush situation. He listened to it with complete seriousness. Vivian watched him listen and felt what she felt, which was what it was. Not the desperate love of the woman in the study, not the guarded assessment of the woman in the cottage, but something that had been built in the space after both of those, in the accumulated weight of Thursday architects and court proceedings, and a man who had stood before the full session of the royal court and said, "I was wrong in a register that made it undeniable." "She's going to win the rosebush argument," Vivian said. "She always wins the rosebush argument," he said. "You let her win. She makes better points." Clara said something emphatic in the direction of the rosebush, apparently delivering a verdict. "She has your constitution," Vivian said. "You said so yourself." He looked at her over their daughter's head. The scar on his jaw was lighter now, a clean line that had settled into his face with the matter-of-fact permanence of the things that stay. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her, with the attention she had learned to read not as management or assessment, but as something he did not have another language for, something that showed up in what he chose to do rather than what he chose to say, which was, she had come to understand, the truest version of him. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "You don't know what about." "No," he said, "but you've had that look for a week." She looked at the manor, at the east wing with its new windows, and the women who moved through it with the specific quality of people relearning what ordinary felt like. At the garden and the rosebush and the evening light, making its slow work across the stone face of a building that had once felt like a sentence and now felt, in the completely specific way of something that had been remade rather than inherited, like hers. "I'm going to stay," she said. He was quiet. She could feel the weight of it, what that meant to him, and that he was not going to perform what it meant to him, was going to hold it with the care of someone who had learned that the best response to a gift was not to overwhelm it. "Not because of the manner," she said, "and not because of what you've done, though you've done it." She looked at Clara, who had resolved the rosebush situation to her satisfaction and was now examining a beetle with the focused attention of someone encountering a new field of data. "Because this is where I want to be. Because I chose it. Because it's mine." She had not said it exactly that way before. The difference between staying and choosing to stay was everything, and they both understood this, and neither of them needed to say so. The evening settled over the garden with the slow patience of things that do not hurry. Clara abandoned the beetle and grabbed a fistful of her father's coat and demanded, in the clear, emphatic language of someone who had not yet learned to soften demands, to be put down so she could go back to the rosebush. He put her down. She ran at the rosebush. Vivian stood in the spring evening in the garden of Blackthorne Manor and looked at the stone face of a house that had tried, once, to be the end of her, and felt the specific quality of a life that was not the one she had walked into in a storm, or the one she had rebuilt in a cottage, or the one she had fought for on a harbor dock at midnight. It was the life on the other side of all of those, the life assembled from what survived, which was, it turned out, more than anyone standing in the ruins ever believed they were carrying. That was the thing that couldn't be taken. Not the manor, not the title, not the land grants or the court proceedings, or any of the architecture of power that men like Hargrove spent their lives building and dismantling. The thing that couldn't be taken was this, the knowledge, earned the hard way, that you had already gone through the worst available option and chosen, in the dark, on a cliff road, in a nursery at midnight, to keep moving. Everything else was built on that. Clara shrieked with triumph at the rosebush. The evening continued its unhurried work, and the halls of Blackthorne Manor held the sound of it. The light, ordinary, improbable sound of a family that had been broken apart and had come back together on different terms, on honest ground, and the specific way of things that are built the second time with the full knowledge of what the first version cost. Not perfect. Not the story anyone had planned. True,